Okay, so today we're talking about lipids. Lipids can be broken down into two major categories, but either way, they tend to be rather nonpolar, so things that are comprised of mostly carbon and hydrogen bonds. And they come in the form of either steroids, which have this basic backbone here. So see how that's three 6-membered rings connected to a 5-membered ring right there? That's sort of the backbone of what steroids look like in your body, including things like cholesterol, and you do need a certain amount of that to function. The other main category is that of fatty acids. So fatty acids can be broken down into many other categories, but these things are what are used, and I'll show you this in a minute, to store energy, otherwise known as fat. We think of fat as a bad thing. We have to have so much energy stored in order to be able to function, though, so that's something to keep in mind. There are other types of categories within the area of fatty acids. So a wax, you have earwax, for example. Waxes are part of this category. Other animals can produce other types of wax, but I'll show you what that structure looks like in just a minute. Triacylglycerols is one of the biggest areas of the lipid or fatty acid category, and this is how we sort of store our fat. So that's sort of what you think of when you think of triacylglycerols. Then we have things like glycerol phospholipids, and that's something that we're going to talk about in a little while, but that's basically going to be the backbone of your cell structure, so that's really, really important. And then finally, sphingolipids. So this is what makes sphingolipids, including things like sphingomyelins. This is what's going to make the outer coating of your nerves, and so it's incredibly important for brain function, and you've got to be able to have a certain amount of that, or your nerves just kind of go crazy. Okay, so let's start with the basics of fatty acids. Go ahead and roll that up there. There we go. So a fatty acid chain has a long tail, and up here we see a carboxylic acid. So see how that's COOH? Well, that carboxylic acid is going to be relatively polar. Remember, it can hydrogen bond. Some people even say twice. So it's really polar. So we refer to this part as the polar end of a fatty acid. And down here where we have all these chains of carbon and hydrogen, that's where the nonpolar portion really lives. All of these are single bonds. And so that's what we define as a saturated fatty acid. In other words, it has all the hydrogens it can take in the carbon chain, okay? So in contrast, this would be an unsaturated, so would this be an unsaturated fatty acid because they have the double bonds that are there. So there's two different ways to have double bonds. You can either have a trans or a cis double bond. Remember how we talked about that earlier? So this would be what's defined as the trans fatty acid, and this is what we define as the cis fatty acid. Now each of these have one double bond. So we refer to them as mono, in other words one, unsaturated fatty acids. So these can have either a cis or a trans arrangement. You've heard of trans fats being bad, right? Well, that's partially because these are nice, really long molecules, and as they go through your arteries, they can get stuck. And so that's a little bit of a bad thing. When you have a double bond, it can actually disrupt the stackability of the molecules, especially if you have something like this. So that what it does is it actually takes the melting point and takes it down, because these aren't going to stack as well as these will. So these have more surface area to kind of interact more, right? But when you get to the double bond stage, like especially with that double bond here that's a cis, it starts to go like this, and so they don't have as much area to sort of stack on top of each other, and therefore they're not attracted to each other as much. and will kind of fall apart easier, and that's why the melting point is lower. Okay? So if you look at something like this with all kinds of double bonds in it, that's what we call a poly, in other words, many unsaturated fatty acid. Their melting point is even going to be much, much lower. So that's something that is relatable to your real life. In part, you've probably seen something that is a vegetable oil in solid form. Okay? We call that like margarines and things like that, right? So what they do is they take things that are polyunsaturated fatty acids like this, and they start to hydrogenate them. Do you remember that from the first chapter we did? So when you do those types of things, what ends up happening is you make them more saturated. As you make them more saturated, then their melting point goes up, and they end up having a nice solid block for you. Okay? Okay, there's another form of another form of lipids called prostaglandins. These things are awesome. They're known as prostaglandins or echinocioids, and they're derivatives of arachidonic acid. These things have really nice long chains, and they can fold in different ways. And when they fold or react in different ways, they become like signals to go do stuff, right? And so as they start to go and signal to go and say, hey, body, go do this, inflame, things like that, then they are messengers for the body. And they're steroid-like compounds, and they're important when it comes to blood pressure, uterine bustle, and inflammation. This inflammation part is what things like NSAIDs target and try to get them to stop forming. So, pretty kind of cool, right? Okay, thank you very much. I'll see you on the next one.